Welcome to the Lenten series, week 4. We're looking at what the Bible had to say about social justice, what we in this time of trouble, what we can look to for inspiration, for direction, for a template, really, of how to respond in a world that seems incredibly hostile to a great many of us. Some of it being directed by one single gathering of political people, but affecting everybody and pretty much the world over. How to respond in these times? The question was asked by a friend of mine. She said, "This is, I think, what we need to be talking about this year for Lent as we struggle to further our journey in a Lenten practice about how we need to be able to stand up, find our own identity." Because one of the things, and I've mentioned it every week, is one of the things we have to watch against is chaos. And panic and chaos are quite linked. So we have to find our grounding, find who we are first, and then move forward. And what does that mean as Christians? Where is our grounding? Where can we look to? So our first week, we looked at the Hebrew scriptures, particularly some of the minor prophets, and really got our center and sense of what we are about, what justice looks like from them. The second week, we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, which is slightly different from the Sermon on the Plain, which is different from the Sermon on the Mount in just the tone. Even though a lot of the same messages are there, the tone is very different. The tone is very pragmatic. And that's what we need to kind of grasp onto. In times of chaos, staying philosophical and theological about things is not particularly helpful. It might be something that those of us who are nerds kind of enjoy doing, but it lacks the sense of getting your hands into something that's tangible, that's workable. Our last week, we looked at the letter of James and the advice given to communities, to people of faith, to get up, get involved, kind of get your perspective, do a kind of a checklist of what it is that we can do, that we should do, to keep within the promise of God, within the expectations of the ministry Jesus called us to, while still making an impact on the world. So now we're moving into post-biblical times. And for this week and next week, we're going to be looking at our essentially 2,000 years of history and how the understandings that we see in the Bible have actually played out over time. And one of the things I absolutely adore about doing these Lenten series is I probably learn more than you do. The opportunity I have to do some study and reflection is quite a gift. It's quite fun. So I started this having my own idea of where the divide was for the 2,000 years of our history. I assumed it was going to be the Industrial Revolution because that's when we look at William Wilberforce just prior to that, and abolition and women's suffrage movement and all that kind of stuff, foot binding in China. I discovered actually that we have to look earlier. So this is actually not going to be looking at the first 1800 years of Christian history, but only the first 15. Because there's a combination that happens with the reformers, the continental reformers. That's Martin Luther, that's Zigli, I can't remember the name, Calvin, those folks, plus that influence on Enlightenment thinkers and the Enlightenment thinkers back, the Anabaptist movement, Zwingli, that's the name. The Anabaptist movement, what's happening with the early days of discovery, what's happening with the hint of the Industrial Revolution and economic shifts and people having to be displaced for economic survival. So there's a whole movement that comes in there. And that dividing line somewhere between 15 and 1700 is where we start doing the shift from charity to social justice. Now, social justice itself is not a term that's coined until around 1840 by an Italian theologian, but it was a concept that had been developing. And notice the difference in tone. Charity is definitely something that we give out of generosity, but it's responding to the situation we're in. Whereas social justice is demanding change at the same time. And that tonal shift is hugely significant to what we're talking about. So for the first 1500 years, the concentration was on charity. None of these folks are oblivious to injustice. It was just not something they believed they could challenge directly through political action, through questioning assumptions, through changes in social value. That really didn't happen so much. So right off the hop, right, just actually getting out of the time of the biblical letters being written. So going all the way back to the 2nd century. So if we work on the assumption that Mark was written around 60, 70, and debates still out about that. Matthew and Luke around 90, 80, 90. Gospel of John written around 90 to the year 100. The letter of James that we looked at last week, if we look at that, put that in around 120, 130 of the Common Era. Right in the middle of that, around 110, 120, 130, 140, somewhere in there, was a document written called the Didache. It's non-biblical. It was the first rules of order, meaning how to behave to represent the Christian community. Now, remember, we're talking first centuries. So the church is small c, and it has multiple variations. Can't even get that word out. Multiple versions, there, how's that one, of what it looks like to be Christian. This is before Trinitarian discussions really took off. This is before any type of church structure happened. This is before we had a lot of the political weight that would eventually come in the Roman Empire. This is early days when the Christians were starting to realize the second coming wasn't imminent. That's what had been driving the first generations, is the belief that Jesus was going to come back any time now. By the time you got a few generations into Christianity, or the early Christian church rather, they started to really challenge whether or not that was going to happen right away, or if it was something that was far in the future, or in the near future, or what. The concept that they could be wrong was not on the table. It was coming. And the Christian church 2,000 years later still believes it is coming. The when keeps changing. So when they started to realize that, you know what, maybe in this generation we won't necessarily see the end, we have to start looking at how we live this faith. It wasn't necessarily a conscious effort. It was a cultural coming of awareness as they move forward. And so one of the first things they had to do, if they're going to have any kind of credibility in this world that at that point was fairly hostile to the proto-Christian church, as well as the proto-Jewish faith, the Hebrews, especially the diaspora, anybody who was connected with Jerusalem, the temple, the Hebrew tradition. There was a great deal of suspicion about that in the Roman world. Greeks were a little bit more open to it, but they'd also been there longer, and they all had this tradition of God-fearer. You know, those people who actually were part of temple worship. They just didn't do that last step of circumcision for the men. So hostile. Nero blamed these folks for the burning of Rome. So there's a lot of tension. Now, one of the things that was not happening was constant persecutions. That's actually an error. There were occasional persecutions, but not constant. However, in order to gain any measure of respect or even peace from their neighbors, they had to establish who they were and who they weren't. And the first thing they did was they wrote a rule of order for those who were representing, so the missionaries who were going out to teach about Christianity. And what's really fascinating about that is they talk about abortions. Don't do abortions, which meant that there was definitely women as part of the crowd, because men weren't part of that kind of thing. But they don't have any word on charity. Nothing. The word doesn't appear, the concept doesn't appear. So in the earliest book of order, there is no sense of controlling what charity looked like. So that's kind of fascinating because we know from historical texts that was going on. We can even see in the later books in the Bible, as well as the non-canonical extracurricular or extra canonical books that we have from the first centuries. We know that charity was a thing, but it was not part of the conscious ordering, this is how we're going to do this kind of thing, that the rules started to identify. The very first rule was the Didache. Then there's the Didascalia and monks' lives, and it develops the whole practice. But the very first version of an order did not include how to go about charity. And that was roughly around the year 100-ish, in there somewhere. And then very quick on that, we do have one of the most fascinating letters in especially feminist Christian history, when Pliny the Younger writes to his godfather, I never can remember his name, asking, what do I do with these Christians that I've found? And Christians at that point in time strictly was shorthand for Christ followers. It was not a capital C religion at that point at all. It wasn't even hinted at. In fact, the Romans didn't even have a concept of religion. You were a person of faith if you breathed, period. There is nothing else that they looked at. So he wrote to his godfather, who was the emperor at the time, and said, what do I do with these Christ followers? I've got 2 women here who claim to be deacons, who are out there preaching and teaching and doing all this stuff. How do I handle them? And reading through Pliny, actually, what he was annoyed by wasn't so much that they were Christians or even so much that they were women. They were actually slave women. That's what really annoyed him. That these slave women, these lowest of the low class, were given authority over free men and women. That was what Pliny really was bothered by. And he talks about the fact that they were doing these charity acts as well as education and whatever. And the word that comes down from his godfather is just don't touch it. Don't get involved with it. Not worth it. Unless they do something actually illegal, just walk away. Leave it alone. So that's coming out of the first early decades of the 2nd century. And from there, we can bounce over to Origen. Now, Origen is one of my favorite early church writers because he was so vast in his interests. Origen became problematic towards the end of his life, which is why we don't talk about Saint Origen. We just talk about Origen. Still recognized as a Christian father, just kind of lost the message, I guess, towards the end. But one of his most famous pieces is known as Contra Celsus. That's Latin. The translation is against Celsus. So Celsus was a Roman senator who was hell bent on destroying any reputation that any Christians had. And we don't know anything directly about him. We just have this work from Origen where he counters everything that Celsus says about what Christians are. And if you go through this text, you have to go book after book. I think there's 7 or 8 books in it. You have to go book after book after book. Almost everything is talking about ritual. It's talking about short structure. It's talking about how they greet each other. It's talking about behavior. Only towards the very end do we get any conversation on charity and being in the world to make it better. And Origen's argument is that we are supposed to support each other and that prayer and worship and meditation are also works of justice. Now, he doesn't use that term, but essentially that's what he's saying, is that through prayer, through conversation with God, we make the world a better place. Celsus, kind of like Pliny, was having issues with the fact that there was mixing of the socioeconomic classes, that the poor were eating at the same table as the rich, and that was just not acceptable to him. And this was, Origen was writing early third century. So we're talking around 2010 Common Era or somewhere in there. So this is still an issue that was coming up, was the intermingling of um, uh, upsetting the social order, of people not knowing their place. Um, Whereas Origen is telling him, or telling Rome essentially through his argument with Celsus, that Christians are just built differently. We do things a little bit differently. We're not a threat to Roman society. You know, they call war, we're still going to be there. But in the meantime, we are going to break down some of those barriers between people and support them. Very, very contrary to the Roman ideology of the day, the paterfamilias, where everything was controlled, even life and death, by the head male. So that kind of distraction really took away from what a lot of the early Christians were doing. However, there's this through line through all of it about how being followers of Christ was not just about worshiping or putting themselves aside or going through rituals or uh, challenging social norms. It was also about helping people. So, nursing the sick, taking care of the homeless, visiting the prisoner, all these things that came up in the Sermon on the Mount, and again in James, Sermon on the Plain, these actions that you're to do. But again, none of them are challenging the social order as far as social justice. The challenging of the order is people can sit together at a table and you have authority based on how godly you are, not on your social economic status. But there was no expectation of balancing those scales, really. There was an acceptance of the social order generally, and Christians saw themselves as pushing against it, but still maintaining it too. It was an interesting kind of dance they tried to do. There was no treatise about this, and I want to stop here for a minute to really give a shout out to a friend of mine, JP, who actually got me in this conversation, thinking about this months ago, before this was even a theme. And he wondered, when did the church started pushing back? I kind of come up with a bunch of ideas, but now I can actually tell him that it was not during the earliest churches. That comes out later. That's the stuff that we're going to deal with next week. The churches really did not challenge the authority. They challenged the moral authority, but not the political authority. They did not look for upending a structure that kept a slave, or kept a rich person rich. They had no problem with them sharing meals together, but they weren't going to marry, that kind of thing. So that was going on in the first couple of centuries. And it develops a little further. And this is at a point where I'm going to bring in the whole concept of the Dark Ages. Anybody who's followed me knows that's a real bugaboo of mine. There was no such thing as a Christian Dark Age. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the church structure had already been developed. So we already had Constantine having gathered everybody just 100 years after Origen fought with Celsus, made Christianity not only legal, but the state religion. And that church structure actually carried folks into the Middle Ages. There was not a complete decay and lack of society. There was just a change in political order where we went from a system of emperors and empires to a system of church leadership. Lots of bumps, lots of bruises along the way, but there was never a dark period. In fact, if you want to get really technical about it, the only dark period, the Dark Ages, that the Western world has ever seen was a period between 1200 and 800 BCE in Greece. And that's before a lot of the Grecian philosophies have been developed. And the only reason it's dark is because we have no information from that period of time. No writings, no architecture or archaeology can't put it together. It's like there's a hole in history. That's what a dark age means. There's darkness. There's no insight or enlightenment into what was going on. There is no 1,000-year period of Christian domination leading to a dark age. None. Didn't happen. There was no 1,000-year period or 800-year period where science was denied and where people were kept backwards. Didn't happen. In fact, most of the attention of the church was on education, especially once you get to Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, and the support of science and discovery, and that's going to take us outside of the parameters of this discussion. But trust me, it's there. So we have people who are written, who are articulate, who are looking at issues, but they're still not looking at challenging the social order as they know it. And out of this sense of charity and action as part of your faith development, we get a whole monastic movement coming. And that the history of the monastic movement itself is kind of interesting. But again, outside the parameters of this discussion, except that some of the groups that will eventually be monastic communities, both male and female, do actually see themselves involved in society again for charity. Some of them removed themselves completely. Some of them saw themselves having being called to be part of the action of making it better. Again, very, very strict parameters on this, however. And one of the earliest and one of the historically best known ones was the Rule of Saint Benedict. And if you read through the Rule of Saint Benedict, it's like hours. It's how to dress, how to sleep, how to organize your structure. It's practical, kind of going back to what the Didache was doing in the second century, giving this list of how we're to behave, how we're to look, how we're to be respectful, how we're to present ourselves to community. But unlike the Didache, Saint Benedict did include what charity looked like, what actions look like. So in his long order, the numbered order, good works was something that was definitely a priority. And we're looking now at around 530 the Common Era. So some of the instructions that he gave people, number 14, was give refreshments to the poor. Don't question why they're thirsty, just give them something to drink. Number 15, clothe the naked. Number 16, visit the sick. See the theme here, it continues on. 17, bury the dead. 18, help those in trouble. Doesn't define trouble, but I can almost guarantee you it's not going to be political trouble, at least not in the way that challenges the society that created that political trouble. It might be encouraging someone to basically accept that they've made a mistake, they've stepped outside of the natural order as they understood it at the time. 19, comfort those in sadness. 20, be a stranger in the world. That's kind of like a modern statement of in the world but not of the world, which you hear a lot in more Anabaptist and evangelical circles. This is something that St. Benedict brought up. Don't be too comfortable in worldly situations. Which kind of speaks to the whole live in poverty, live in obedience. Do not look to aggrandize yourself. And then down number 26, towards the end of his, or the middle of his list rather, he says, don't abandon charity. Charity and faith were kind of parts of the same project as far as the early church was considered, and that does not change in any of the orders of any of the monastic communities. By the time you get to the 1200s of the Common Era, we see not only proper communities inside building complexes of men and women who are considered religious, who are nuns and monks and friars and all that good stuff. But we also start to see a third order emerging. So lay people who are looking to have some kind of definition, but who are not interested in becoming part of the monastic communities around them. in it's called the Lowlands. Belgium, parts of Germany, Holland, that kind of area. There was a group of women known as the Beguine. There was a brother group called the Beggards, but they came together willingly. They didn't take orders. They could come or go in the community as much as possible. There was no mother house originally. There was just a group of houses that they kind of lived in community in the middle of town. They didn't go out to the outskirts like the nuns and monks did. And they were known as lay order. So when you get to the orders of Saint Francis by the early to mid 1200s of the Common Era, you have very definitely the first order is for monks, the second order is for nuns, and the third order is for lay folk. And they were, especially those who were following the orders of Saint Francis. Saint Francis might be really common to folks as someone who was really in the community. The Franciscans were known for their love of all people, looking for peace. In fact, the Christian Christian song "Channel of Your Peace" is based on a prayer of Saint Francis. Make me a channel of your peace. Put me out into the world. Where there's difficulty, I'm going to try to fix it. Where there's sadness, I'm trying to try to make it better. That's what kind of drove the Franciscans. So we have orders of people coming together, and again, they recognized that so much of their faith needed to have an action role. And this is one of the things that St. Francis warned about at this point in time, was the difference between piety and active faith. That piety, that that gets really self-righteous really fast, when all you're doing is focusing on your own spirituality, your own development, and you're not actually being in the community making it better, then you're missing the point. So for St. Francis, this whole idea of social action, of charity, needed to be wed to your faith. Your faith was not full without that as an element. So again, the themes that we saw in James, the themes that we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, the expectations we saw in the Minor Prophets, keep coming up again, that faith and action go hand in hand. That we need to make sure that we're not sucked in. And I would suggest that a lot of the modern right-wing Christian evangelical movement has erred to the side of piety. They have not carried on the tradition of social action, social engagement, to their detriment. And look how lost that is. They're now judging others, but they're not in there making it different. You can find so many mainline traditions who are actually trying to make it different. Failing, sure, but the effort is there, the consciousness is there. And all it goes back to these early leaders who called the Christian community to develop this part of who we are. That we cannot be people of faith if we are not people of social action and engagement. So carrying on that through line, and recognizing that St. Francis was even teaching about simplicity in all of this. So it doesn't even have to be complicated. It can be very simple, like going back to the rules of St. Benedict. Give a drink, give clothing, give comfort, be there to help support people. None of that, again, changing society, but all of that changing the community that you're engaging in. And as we're looking at ways we can respond, this is our first place of action. There's absolutely nothing wrong with charity. There's a need for it, and it's a good place to start. And if that's all you can give, that's not bad. That's actually pretty good. If you can move on from charity to social justice, as the Christian church does as it matures, then we're getting into more levels of social engagement that we'll talk about next week. But the whole idea of charity and action is very, very significant. And one of the reasons we have to to acknowledge action is because by the time we get to the reformers, we have a backlash against action for a lot of different reasons. Martin Luther is going to call it works righteousness, which is essentially his belief that the letter, like the writing of the letter of James and a lot of this stuff that he believes the Catholic Church at the time is trying to convince people that you'll get your salvation through work, which was never the premise to start with. It's belief and work. But Martin Luther only focused on the work part and said we get our salvation, we get our gifts through grace. And there's no place in there where grace is denied. But Martin Luther put an emphasis on things that actually would start another ball rolling that will eventually get us to go through the Enlightenment. It will get us to go through the response to the Industrial Revolution, redistribution of wealth, the egregious separation of economic status. Because one of the things that is forgotten is that during the Middle Ages, there was not that big a gap between the poor and the rich. By the time we get to the Industrial Revolution, the gap is huge. And that is the world in which social justice emerges. That's next week's conversation. This week is looking at the fact that there is a through line of how to respond. Once we are grounded when we've got our feet grounded, then we can look at how to be kind to each other, what charity looks like, what it means to be Jesus' representation in the world before it takes on the element of political challenge. And we've got a rich history of that, and we can look at various epochs and show us some examples of what that's going to look like. So that's bringing us up to around 1500. Next week, our last week of our discussion, we're going to be looking at what happened, who happened to bring so much forward, and where we are now as Christians, and where social justice is such a primary part of how we're called to live our faith. That if we want to respond to the world around us in a Christ-like manner, we have to be people of justice and change and acceptance. So I leave this with you, and I will see you next week. Thanks.